In our own world, technology has rapidly advanced over the last few centuries. To someone born in 1800, the world would be unrecognizable to them in 1900, and to someone born in 1900, the world would be unrecognizable to them in 2000. But in Middle-earth and many other fantasy worlds, technology seemingly stays the same for thousands or even tens of thousands of years, in a way that feels unrealistic to us. But is it unrealistic? In this video, let's talk about why technology didn't really advance in Middle-earth. Before I talk about Middle-earth, I do need to talk about some misconceptions that some people have about technological progress. If we're looking at things from a European perspective, it's easy to look at technological progress as some sort of tech tree, like something from civilization, where technologies are linear. Researching one thing will naturally lead you towards another, and because of that, societies all progress in the exact same way. And it's easy to apply that thinking to Middle-earth or any other fantasy setting, because just like in the real world, after thousands of years, Middle-earth should see some technological progress. But technology isn't simple, it isn't linear, and technological progress is helped or hindered by many different things. For example, a culture that values learning and innovation might advance, one that is based on heavy-handed tradition and repression might not. A society that dwells in a jungle or a barren plain will face more obstacles than a society that dwells in a temperate region with fertile lands. A nomadic society will not develop the same way a settled society will. A land-based society will not develop the same way a sea-based society will. Technology, like all knowledge, can also be lost. During periods of great unrest and destruction, a society might collapse, its progress might stagnate or even reverse, and its secrets could be lost. All of this is to say that saying Middle-earth should have advanced after thousands of years because that's what's happened in our own world is kind of just wrong. Humans have been around for 300,000 years or so, and most of our progress has come in the last few thousand years, or realistically, the last 200 years. And none of that progress was guaranteed. Plenty of technological advancements came out of the Middle East, India, and China, but for one reason or another, none of these places could kick on to industrialization like Europe did. And even as Europe industrialized, there were plenty of humans around the world still living as hunter-gatherers, as they had for tens of thousands of years. So if you were to apply real-world logic to Middle-earth, you would still be wrong in saying that Middle-earth should have advanced. But here's the other thing. You shouldn't apply real-world logic to Middle-earth because that ignores a number of advantages and disadvantages that existed in Arda. For example, the peoples in Middle-earth are entirely different. After all, there's fantastical creatures such as elves and dwarves. There's also the existence of magic in Middle-earth, which in many ways can replace technology. And finally, there's the whole concept of Arda Marred, a taint placed upon the world by Morgoth that literally damages everything in it. Firstly, let's talk about the people who live in Middle-earth. One thing you might wonder is, with people like the elves and dwarves, surely it would have been much easier for technology to progress. After all, each individual can amass a far greater wealth of knowledge and experience, and a particularly brilliant individual can be around for much longer, or forever in the case of the elves, to have an impact on society. And at a surface level, this seems logical. After all, if someone like Einstein or any other great scientist could have lived 200 years longer, who knows what they could have come up with? But this relies on the belief that elves and dwarves are the same and think the same as modern humans, and obviously they aren't and they don't. For example, elves largely have a reverence for nature and beauty, especially forests, something that Tolkien saw as the complete opposite of technological progress such as industrialization. Many elves also didn't really have the same ambitions as men, and thanks to their immortal lifespans, they generally did things much slower. For example, it took hundreds of years to create the Rings of Power. And speaking of the Rings of Power, the elves were a deeply magical race, something that I will talk about more soon. As for the dwarves, their scope and focus was rather limited. They cared for mining, smithing, crafting, and building, and not much else. For example, they didn't even grow their own food if they could get away with it. This makes them come across as industrious, and therefore you would think that technological progress would be highly beneficial to them. But once again, dwarves also had a reverence of beauty and nature, much like the elves, and they also interacted deeply with magic. What I mean to say is that in both the cases of the elves and dwarves, there wasn't this ambition to further science and technology. Boundaries were pushed using magic, and often in regards to creating something of beauty as opposed to practical use. if not elves and dwarves, then why didn't men progress? Well, here's the thing. They did, some groups more than others. There were the Númenóreans who rivaled the highest of elves in terms of power and advancement, and on the complete opposite end of the spectrum you had plenty of hunter-gatherers such as the Druidine or the Lossoth. And that leads me back to my point about the real world. Different groups of men in Middle-earth faced conditions or advantages and disadvantages that led them down different paths. The Lossoth ended up in the frozen north of Middle-earth. They weren't going to develop anything beyond that which helped them survive. And the Númenóreans received direct tutelage from the elves and the Ainur. Of course, they were going to far exceed other groups of men. But once again, you could ask the question, why didn't the Númenóreans then develop further? I'd say they did in some ways, especially in terms of shipbuilding and other technologies such as unbreakable walls and steel bows. If you're asking specifically why they didn't industrialize, it's worth pointing out that in some of Tolkien's earliest drafts they actually did. It's alluded to that under Sauron's tutelage they developed steel ships and cannons. Fortunately or unfortunately, this and the idea of some sort of steampunk Númenor was abandoned. In reality, I'd say it's due to a combination of things. The earliest Númenóreans were very similar in outlook and temperament to elves, thus it makes sense that like the elves, they wouldn't have this ambition to advance. But as time passed, this ambition did appear and it led to moral decay, specifically around the idea of death and eternal life, which was accompanied by a decline in splendor and wisdom. Thus, all Númenórean advancement became centered around the concept of death, developing a greater war machine to deal death to their enemies, building great tombs to honor the dead, and trying to find a path to immortality through alchemy. This is to say that the Númenóreans probably could have industrialized, but they didn't have the desire at first, and when a desire did appear, it led them down a completely different path. Okay, let's talk about the second big factor, magic. The important thing to remember about magic is that it can sort of act as an alternative to a technology in many universes, even in a universe with a soft magic system like Tolkien's. Some examples, an automatic door powered by electricity, or a magic door activated by giving a password. The Doors of Durin, a device that can transmit sound and show images across long distances like a phone, or a magical orb that can do the exact same thing. The Palantiri, a flying machine with massive engines powered by fuel, or Vingalot, a Arundel's flying ship. Small globes that are powered with electricity, or lamps that have captured starlight, the Feanorian lamps. There's many other examples. Mirivor, Lembas, the Rings of Power, Minas Morgul's rotating tower, the Watcher Stones outside Cirith Ungol. So, in societies where magic is sort of ever-present or at least heavily used, such as with the elves, the dwarves, or even the Númenóreans, magic basically becomes a substitute for technological progress. It also has the advantage of being able to coexist with nature far better than technology, which is important when so many different groups value the preservation of beauty. That doesn't mean magic can do everything, and we see ways in which technology supersedes it, such as Saruman and Sauron seemingly using explosives against Helm's Deep and the Rammasakur. Well, that's assuming the explosives are gunpowder and not magical in nature. But if you're a race, like the elves, that is already inherently magical, then why not use magic instead of attempting to conjure up some form of technology? Finally, let's talk about Arda Marred. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of Arda Marred, I'll explain it. Basically, when Morgoth was striving against the other Valar for mastery over the world, he poured a great deal of his power into Arda itself. While this weakened Morgoth significantly, it ensured that his corruption remained in the world long after he was gone, and this corruption gradually decayed everything magical. In other words, thanks to Morgoth, almost everything in the world becomes more mundane over time as magic, in all its forms, fades. Arda Marred has a huge impact on the elves. It weakens their bodies over time, which will eventually cause their spirits to overpower them, leaving them houseless, a process known as fading. It's why the elves sail into the west, because Valinor is the only place free of this effect following the destruction of Númenor. In Middle-earth, it's why the 3 elven rings were so important. They slowed this decay and allowed places like Rivendell, Lothlorien, and originally Lindon to stay magical, almost frozen in time. After the 3 rings are rendered useless, these lands are abandoned and they rapidly fade. But Arda Marred's impact on technology can be seen the most with the Númenóreans. Thanks to Arda Marred, the Númenóreans declined with every subsequent generation, most prominently in lifespan, but also physically and mentally. With every generation being lesser than the one that came before, the Númenóreans not only stagnated in technology, but also seemingly went backwards. They went backwards in terms of medicine and shipbuilding, and also lost specific technologies such as steel bows and the unbreakable black stone that Orthanc and the outer wall of Minas Tirith were made of. I do, however, want to point out that we don't know how much magic played a part in any of these technologies and knowledge. That being said, Arda Marred didn't make progress impossible. In Rivendell, Glowin mentions that while dwarves can't match their forefathers in craft, they are actually building bigger and better. And as I mentioned earlier, Saruman and Sauron both seem to have devised explosives of some sort. But without a doubt, Arda Marred did add an extra barrier, and it provides an explanation as to why Gondor didn't improve on Númenor. Pressing forward is difficult when you're desperately trying to keep the knowledge from the past from slipping away. Not because your society is in decay because it functions poorly, but because there's a far greater force tied to the world itself that is moving against you. Okay, so to summarize, why didn't technology progress in Middle-earth? Well, firstly, it's an incorrect assumption that technology will advance simply because thousands of years have passed, because even in our own world, progress was not guaranteed. Technology advanced at different rates depending on a wide variety of factors. Sometimes it didn't advance at all for tens of thousands of years, and sometimes it even went backwards. Secondly, the people in Middle-earth didn't necessarily have a desire to progress technologically. Many peoples were content with the way things were. Thirdly, magic provided a more reliable alternative to technology, an alternative that could coexist with nature rather than destroy it. And finally, Arda Marred meant that the peoples in Middle-earth were in a constant battle with entropic forces that caused everything to decay. This meant that many of their efforts were spent on holding on to the knowledge and power of the past rather than necessarily looking towards the future. For all of these reasons combined, I think it's fair enough that the peoples of Middle-earth didn't really progress all that much within the scope of the tale. But beyond the scope of the tale, well, who knows? Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. During this video, I mentioned that Tolkien played around with the idea of something of a steampunk Númenor, where the Númenóreans had metal ships, flying ships, and artillery. If you want to learn more about that, I've linked my video on that at the end here. Cheers, farewell, and remember, technology didn't advance in Middle-earth because there was no science victory.